The wedding that ended my family. The day my father disowned me wasn't the day he lost his daughter. It was the day he lost the only person who would one day save him. Standing in front of more than 300 wedding guests, he pointed at the man I loved and said, "If you marry that poor carpenter, don't ever call yourself a Morgan again." The room fell silent. My mother cried. My brother looked away. I thought I was losing everything. But 5 years later, the same father who threw me out of his life stood outside my front door with nothing left, not his mansion, not his business, not even his pride. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, would you choose love over your family's approval? If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to drop a comment, like this video, and subscribe to Betrayal Stories for more powerful stories every day. Now, let me tell you my story. My name is Claire Morgan, and this is how my own father chose money over his daughter. People say every family has secrets. Mine had rules. Rules about how to dress. Rules about how to behave. Rules about who was worthy of sitting at our dinner table. But there was one rule that mattered more than all the others. Never embarrass the Morgan family. My father, Edward Morgan, repeated those words almost every day. He wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most respected real estate developers in the state. People admired him. Business magazines interviewed him. Politicians invited him to charity dinners. To everyone else, he looked like the perfect father. But behind closed doors, love always came second. Reputation came first. As a little girl, I thought every father was like mine. He bought expensive birthday gifts, paid for private schools, took us on luxury vacations. But he rarely hugged me, never asked how I felt. Instead, he'd ask things like, "What grade did you get? Did you win? Did anyone important notice you?" Nothing was ever enough. When I graduated from college with honors, he simply nodded. Good. Then he handed me brochures from business schools. No congratulations. No hug. Just another expectation. My mother, Helen, was different. She loved quietly. She'd leave little notes in my lunchbox, bake my favorite cookies, sit beside me whenever Dad criticized me. But she never stood up to him. Not because she didn't love me, because she was afraid. Afraid of losing the life we'd built. Afraid of disappointing the man she'd spent 30 years trying to please. Everything changed the afternoon I met Mason Reed. It wasn't romantic. No dramatic music. No perfect timing. I was driving home during a thunderstorm when one of my tires exploded. The road was nearly empty. My phone had no signal. I stood beside my car wondering what to do. Then an old pickup truck pulled over. A tall man climbed out wearing dusty work boots and a faded flannel shirt. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so." He smiled. "I've got a spare jack if you don't mind waiting." For almost 20 minutes, he worked in the pouring rain while I stood under his umbrella. When he finished, I reached into my purse. "At least let me pay you." He shook his head. My dad taught me something. Helping people isn't a business. It's a choice. That sentence stayed with me all night. Over the next few months, we kept seeing each other. Sometimes at the local coffee shop. Sometimes at the hardware store. Eventually, I learned he owned a tiny woodworking shop inherited from his grandfather. He wasn't rich. Far from it. He built custom tables, bookshelves, rocking chairs, anything people needed. Some weeks he barely earned enough to cover rent. But I'd never met someone who smiled so easily. He laughed with children, remembered everyone's name, stopped to help strangers. People respected him, not because of money, because of his character. Our first date wasn't at a 5-star restaurant. It was a food truck festival downtown. We shared one burger because neither of us was hungry enough for two. Then we walked beside the river until midnight talking about dreams. He told me he wanted to build furniture people would pass down through generations. I told him I wanted a family where children never questioned whether they were loved. He looked at me and quietly said, "I think we'd make a pretty good team." I smiled. "I think so too." For nearly a year, I kept our relationship secret. Not because I was ashamed, because I knew exactly how my father would react. Eventually, secrets become impossible to keep. One Sunday afternoon, Dad asked, "Is there someone?" I nodded. "There is." "What does he do?" "He's a carpenter." Silence. Then came a laugh. Not a happy laugh. A disappointed one. "A carpenter?" "Yes." "Tell me you're joking." "I'm not." He placed his newspaper on the table. "Claire, our family doesn't marry people who struggle to pay bills. He works harder than anyone I know." Working hard and succeeding aren't the same thing. "I love him." Dad stood. "No. You're confused. I know exactly how I feel. You'll end this relationship." "I'm not ending anything." For the first time in my life, I watched disappointment turn into anger. "You are a Morgan. You have responsibilities. I'm your daughter. I'm not a business contract." Over the following weeks, Dad arranged dinners with wealthy businessmen, young lawyers, the son of a senator, even a billionaire's nephew. Every conversation felt like an interview. Every man talked about investments, vacation homes, luxury cars. None of them asked what made me laugh. None asked about my dreams. Then I'd meet Mason afterward. We'd eat tacos on a park bench, watch the sunset, talk for hours. He made me feel seen, not evaluated, loved, not measured. One crisp autumn evening, Mason invited me to the workshop where he built furniture. The smell of fresh cedar filled the room. Half-finished tables stood against the walls. In one corner, he'd built something himself. A wooden bench. On the backrest were carved the words, "Home isn't where you live. It's who you live for." I traced the letters with my fingertips. "It's beautiful." He smiled nervously. "I made it for our future house." I laughed. "Our future house?" He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and got down on one knee. "Claire Morgan, I don't own a mansion. I don't have millions. But I promise you'll never spend a single day wondering if you're loved. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred my vision. Without thinking, I whispered, "Yes." When I told my parents, everything changed. Dad exploded. "If you marry that man, don't expect this family to stand beside you." Mom begged him to calm down. Ryan stayed silent. But I had already made my decision. Not because Mason was perfect, because for the first time in my life, someone loved me for who I was, not for the last name I carried. I had no idea that saying yes to the man I loved would cost me my father. The morning of my wedding should have been filled with excitement. Instead, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. Outside my bedroom window, the sun had just started rising. Birds were singing, and everything looked peaceful. But inside our mansion, peace didn't exist. For nearly 2 weeks, my father hadn't spoken more than 3 sentences to me. Each one sounded exactly the same. "Call off the wedding. It's not too late. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Every time, I gave him the same answer. "I'm marrying Mason." At 8 that morning, my mother quietly entered my room. She was carrying my wedding dress. The same dress we'd picked together months earlier before everything fell apart. She gently laid it across the bed. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. She helped fasten the buttons on the back of my dress. Then suddenly, her hands stopped. When I looked into the mirror, I saw tears running down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For not protecting you." I turned around. "You've always protected me." She shook her head. "No." I stayed quiet. "I should have stood up to your father years ago." I hugged her tightly. "It's okay, Mom." She cried even harder. "No, it isn't." The ceremony was being held at a beautiful old church surrounded by oak trees. It wasn't expensive. Mason and I had paid for almost everything ourselves. Simple white flowers decorated the entrance. Our closest friends smiled as they welcomed guests. Everything looked exactly the way we'd imagined. Except, one seat remained empty. My father's. Mason stood at the altar wearing a navy blue suit. The moment he saw me, his entire face lit up. That smile erased every fear I'd carried all morning. As I slowly walked toward him, I realized something. For the first time in my life, someone was looking at me with pure love. Not expectation, not judgment, just love. The ceremony began. The pastor welcomed everyone. Family, friends, neighbors, old classmates. Even some of my father's business associates had come. Everyone smiled. Everyone. Except one person. Just as the pastor prepared to begin, the large wooden church doors opened. My father walked inside. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. He wore one of his expensive black suits. His expression was impossible to read. He didn't smile. He didn't greet anyone. He simply walked to the very front row and sat beside my mother. For one brief moment, hope returned. Maybe, just maybe, he had come to support me after all. I couldn't have been more wrong. The ceremony continued. The pastor spoke about commitment, trust, sacrifice, choosing each other every single day. Then he looked at us and smiled. Marriage is built on love. I glanced at Mason. He squeezed my hand. Everything felt perfect. Until the pastor asked the traditional question. If anyone here has any lawful reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, please speak now. A loud scraping sound echoed across the church. My father stood. The room became completely silent. Even the children stopped moving. Dad slowly walked toward the center aisle. Every step echoed across the wooden floor. When he reached us, he looked directly at Mason, then at me. I object. Gasps filled the church. The pastor looked confused. Sir. My father raised his hand. I'm not finished. He pointed directly at Mason. This man has absolutely nothing. He rents a tiny workshop. He barely earns enough to survive. He cannot provide the life my daughter deserves. Every guest stared at us. I could hear whispers spreading through the church. Mason remained calm. He didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. He simply stood beside me. Dad looked back at me. Claire, you still have time. Walk away. I'll pretend none of this ever happened. I looked into my father's eyes. For years, I'd searched those eyes hoping to find approval. Today, there was only pride. I can't. His jaw tightened. What did you say? I said, I can't. I love him. The church fell silent again. Dad laughed bitterly. Love. You think love pays mortgages? You think love builds successful families? I quietly answered. No, but it builds happy ones. His face turned bright red. You would throw away everything I've built. For a carpenter? I'd rather spend my life with an honest carpenter than a dishonest millionaire. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. My father's business partners looked embarrassed. No one expected me to answer him, especially not in public. Dad took one more step toward me. His voice became louder. If you marry him today, you are no longer my daughter. You'll never enter my house again. You'll receive nothing from me. No inheritance. No financial support. No family. He pointed toward the church doors. When you walk through those doors, don't ever come back. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the money. Not because of the inheritance. Because the man standing in front of me wasn't acting like my father. He was acting like a stranger. My mother suddenly stood. Edward, please stop. You're humiliating her. He didn't even look at her. Ryan lowered his head. He couldn't bring himself to defend either of us. The pastor quietly asked, Claire, would you like to stop the ceremony? Before I could answer, Mason gently whispered, if you want to leave, I'll understand. I looked at him in surprise. You would? He nodded. I never wanted you to lose your family because of me. At that moment, I realized something. Mason was willing to sacrifice his own happiness. For mine. My father was willing to sacrifice mine. For his pride. The choice suddenly became very easy. I smiled through my tears. I turned toward the pastor. I'm ready. Then I looked at my father one last time. You taught me something when I was little. His expression remained cold. You always said, Never run away from what you believe in. I finally listened. His face hardened. You'll regret this. I quietly answered. No. I'll regret living someone else's life. The pastor continued the ceremony. Mason and I exchanged our vows. When he placed the simple ring on my finger, his hands were shaking. So are yours, he whispered. I laughed softly. I know. When it was my turn. I looked into his eyes. I don't promise a perfect life. I promise that no matter how difficult life becomes, I'll face it beside you. He smiled. And I'll never let you face it alone. I now pronounce you husband and wife. The church erupted into applause. Friends stood. Some guests cried. Others smiled. My father didn't move. He turned around, walked toward the exit. Without saying goodbye, without looking back, the heavy church doors closed behind him. For the second time that day, silence filled the room. I watched those doors for several seconds. It felt like an entire chapter of my life had just closed forever. Then I felt Mason gently take my hand. We should go. I nodded. Together. We walked out of that church. Not toward a mansion. Not toward wealth. But toward a future we would build ourselves. I had no idea that the man who had just rejected me would one day stand outside my own front door, begging for another chance, building a life from nothing. The first night in our apartment felt strangely peaceful. There were no marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, no housekeepers walking through the hallways. Just an old apartment with squeaky wooden floors, a tiny kitchen, and one bedroom barely large enough for a queen-sized bed. Yet, it was the first place that truly felt like home. Mason looked around and laughed. Well, it's not exactly a palace. I smiled. No, but nobody here is pretending. He wrapped his arms around me. We'll make it beautiful. The next morning reality arrived. Bills, rent, groceries, electricity, insurance. For the first time in my life, every dollar mattered. Mason left before sunrise for his workshop. He kissed my forehead. I'll be back around 7. Don't work too hard. He smiled. I have a wife to take care of now. I laughed. We take care of each other. Finding work turned out to be much harder than I expected. I had a business degree, excellent grades, strong recommendations. Yet every interview ended the same way. We'll call you. Nobody ever did. Finally, during one interview, the hiring manager looked genuinely uncomfortable. Claire, I think you deserve an explanation. I frowned. What do you mean? He leaned forward. Yesterday your father called. My heart sank. He asked us not to hire you. I stared at him. What? He said anyone who hires you shouldn't expect future business from Morgan Developments. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Even after disowning me, my father still wanted to control my life. That evening I sat quietly on our apartment balcony. Mason noticed immediately. You've been crying. I'm okay. He sat beside me. No, you don't have to pretend with me. So I told him everything. Every interview. Every rejection. Every phone call my father had made. When I finished, Mason remained silent. Not because he didn't care. Because he was choosing his words carefully. Finally he smiled. Good. I looked at him in confusion. Good. They closed one door. We'll build another. His optimism amazed me. A week later, I accepted a job at a small neighborhood bookstore. The pay wasn't great, but I loved books. The owner, Mrs. Simmons, hired me without asking about my family. She only asked one question. Can you recommend your favorite novel? I smiled. About 100 of them. She laughed. You're hired. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. Mason's workshop wasn't doing much better. Some weeks he sold 2 pieces. Other weeks, nothing. One Friday evening, he spread several unpaid bills across our kitchen table. We're falling behind. I nodded quietly. I know. I've been thinking. What? Maybe I should close the workshop and get a factory job. The words broke my heart. Building furniture wasn't just his job. It was his dream. I reached across the table and held his hand. No. We'll figure something out. But what if we don't? We will. I believe in you. He smiled. Sometimes. I think you believe in me more than I believe in myself. The following weekend, we decided to sell some of Mason's handmade furniture at a local community market. We borrowed a friend's trailer, loaded 3 coffee tables, 2 bookshelves, 1 handmade rocking chair. By noon, we hadn't sold a single thing. People admired the craftsmanship, then looked at the prices. It's beautiful, but I can buy something cheaper. One customer after another walked away. By late afternoon, only 1 rocking chair had sold, for barely enough to cover the cost of the wood. Mason quietly began loading everything back into the trailer. I guess Dad was right. I turned toward him immediately. No, he wasn't. We're failing. We're learning. There's a difference. As we prepared to leave, an elderly woman approached us. She slowly ran her fingers across one of Mason's dining tables. Who made this? I did. She smiled. My husband used to build furniture like this. They don't make craftsmanship like this anymore. She reached into her purse. I'd like to buy it. Mason looked surprised. It's our most expensive piece. I know. I'll take it. She handed him a business card. Grace Sullivan, interior designer. If my clients like your work, you'll be hearing from me. That night, Mason couldn't stop looking at the business card. Do you think she'll actually call? I think she will. 3 days later, she did. Grace wanted custom furniture for one of her luxury home projects. It wasn't a huge order. Just 6 dining chairs, a table, 2 bookshelves. But it was more work than Mason had received in months. He worked day and night. Every detail had to be perfect. I helped sand the wood after work, packed deliveries, answered emails. Slowly, our tiny apartment became half home, half workshop. 2 months later, Grace called again. This client loved your work. I have another project, then another, and another. Soon, architects began asking for Mason by name. Interior designers started recommending him. The workshop stayed busy. For the first time since our wedding, we paid every bill on time. Mason framed the receipt from our last overdue payment. He laughed. I never want to see another late notice. Edward Morgan had no idea our lives were beginning to change. He still believed we'd eventually come crawling back. What he didn't know was that cracks had already started appearing inside his own empire. At one of his company meetings, his longtime business partner, Leonard Hayes, quietly approved a risky investment without Edward reading the full contract. Edward signed it anyway. He trusted Leonard completely. It would become the biggest mistake of his entire life. One evening, as Mason locked up the workshop, he looked at me and smiled. Do you remember what your father said? I nodded. He said I'd never be able to give you a good life. Mason slipped his hand into mine. I may never own the biggest company in the city, but one day, I'll build something he'll never understand. I smiled. What's that? A home. And standing there, outside that tiny workshop, I realized something. Success wasn't arriving all at once. It was arriving one small victory at a time. Neither of us knew it yet, but the life we dreamed about had finally begun. Success they never expected. 3 years passed faster than I ever imagined. The tiny woodworking shop where Mason had spent countless sleepless nights no longer looked the same. The old leaking roof had been replaced. New machines filled the workshop. The smell of fresh oak and walnut still lingered in the air, but now it mixed with the sound of employees laughing, forklifts moving timber, and customers walking through the showroom. Sometimes I stood in the doorway just watching. Not because I couldn't believe how much we'd achieved, but because I remembered the days when we weren't sure we could even afford dinner. Mason walked over, wiping sawdust from his hands. What are you smiling about? I looked around. You did this. He laughed. No, we did. A few months earlier, Grace Sullivan had introduced Mason's furniture to one of the country's biggest interior designers. What started as one dining table quickly became an order for an entire luxury hotel. Then another hotel. Then a chain of executive offices. Every project brought new opportunities. Our small business finally had a name. Reed Heritage Furniture. People no longer bought Mason's furniture because it was affordable. They bought it because they wanted the craftsmanship. I had left my bookstore job 6 months earlier. Managing orders became a full-time responsibility. Emails poured in every day. Phone calls never stopped. Sometimes we stayed in the office until midnight planning deliveries. Neither of us complained. We remembered what it felt like to worry about paying rent. Hard work no longer frightened us. Going backwards did. One Saturday morning, we held the grand opening of our first showroom. More than 200 people attended. Local reporters interviewed Mason. Customers lined up before the doors even opened. As I looked across the crowd, something caught my attention. A familiar black luxury sedan slowly drove past the building. It didn't stop, but I recognized it immediately. My father's car. He had come. He simply wasn't ready to admit it. That evening, after the event ended, Mason found a folded piece of paper lying beneath the office door. There was no name, just one handwritten sentence. Success built with honesty lasts longer than success built on pride. We never discovered who left it. But somehow, those words stayed with us. 2 weeks later, something happened that changed our business forever. A famous television host shared a photo of one of Mason's handcrafted dining tables on social media. She wrote, "The finest craftsmanship I've seen in years." Within 24 hours, our website crashed. Thousands of visitors flooded the page. Orders arrived from every corner of the country. Customers waited months just to receive one table. Tea changed. With success came difficult decisions. We hired 20 new employees, leased a larger manufacturing building, purchased modern equipment. Every contract was carefully reviewed. Every employee was treated with respect. Mason insisted on learning every worker's name. Every Friday afternoon, he'd walk through the workshop shaking hands. "Thank you for your hard work." It surprised people. Most owners never left their offices. Mason never forgot what it felt like to work with his own hands. One afternoon, our accountant entered my office carrying several reports. "You should see this." He placed the papers on my desk. Our annual revenue had exceeded $5 million. I stared at the numbers. 5 years earlier, we'd celebrated because we could finally pay our electricity bill on time. Now, our company employed more than 50 families. I quietly closed the report. Money wasn't what made me emotional. It was remembering where we'd started. That evening, Mason and I visited the small apartment where we'd lived after our wedding. Nothing had changed. The same cracked staircase. The same tiny balcony. The same old grocery store across the street. We sat inside my car for several minutes. "I miss this place," Mason admitted. I smiled. "Really?" "It reminds me." "Of what?" "That everything we have today started here." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old envelope. Inside was the first unpaid electricity bill we'd never been able to forget. I keep it to remind myself never to become arrogant. I squeezed his hand. "You won't." While our business continued growing, things inside Morgan Developments were moving in the opposite direction. Edward Morgan refused to believe the construction market was changing. He continued investing millions into luxury office buildings while demand slowly declined. His longtime business partner, Leonard Hayes, kept reassuring him. Everything is under control. Edward trusted him without question. After all, they had worked together for over 20 years. What Edward didn't know was that Leonard had quietly been moving company money into fake investment accounts. Millions of dollars. Gone. At home, my mother began noticing changes. Edward stopped sleeping. He skipped dinner. Sometimes he remained inside his office until 3 in the morning. When she asked what was wrong, he gave the same answer every time. Business. Nothing more. One Sunday afternoon, Ryan unexpectedly called me. It was the first conversation we'd had in almost a year. "Claire, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "How's business?" I smiled. "It's going well." He hesitated. "Really well." I laughed softly. "Why are you asking?" There was silence. Then he quietly admitted, "Dad talks about Mason more than you'd think." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He keeps asking people if your company is actually successful." "What do you tell him?" "The truth." "And what's that?" Ryan smiled. "That his daughter built something he never believed she could." A week later, I received an invitation to the annual City Business Excellence Awards. To my surprise, Mason had been nominated for Entrepreneur of the Year. The ceremony would be attended by many of the city's biggest business leaders, including Edward Morgan. When I showed Mason the invitation, he looked nervous. "You don't have to go." He shook his head. "No. I've spent enough years being afraid of your father. It's time he sees who we've become." I smiled. "Not because we need his approval." He nodded. "Because we earned our place." Neither of us realized that award ceremony would become the first time my father truly understood how badly he had underestimated us. And by then, the foundation beneath his own empire had already begun to crumble. The empire begins to fall. The night of the City Business Excellence Awards was unlike anything Mason and I had ever experienced. 5 years earlier, we had walked out of our wedding with nothing but hope. Now, we were walking into the city's most prestigious business event. Black suits, designer dresses, luxury cars lined the entrance. Photographers waited outside. Reporters interviewed successful entrepreneurs before they entered the ballroom. As we stepped onto the red carpet, one reporter stopped us. "Mr. Reed, how does it feel to be nominated for Entrepreneur of the Year?" Mason smiled nervously. "It still doesn't feel real." "What inspired your success?" He looked at me before answering. "My wife. If she hadn't believed in me when nobody else did, I wouldn't be standing here." I felt my eyes fill with tears. Even after everything we'd achieved, he still gave me the credit. Inside the ballroom, more than 400 guests filled the room. Business owners, politicians, investors, television personalities. As we found our table, my heart suddenly skipped. Across the room sat Edward Morgan, my father. He hadn't seen me yet. He was speaking with several investors, pretending everything was normal. His hair had more gray than I remembered. His smile looked forced. For the first time, he looked tired. Ryan noticed us first. He whispered something to Dad. Slowly, Dad turned around. Our eyes met. For several seconds, neither of us moved. No anger, no shouting, just silence. Then, he looked away. Dinner passed quietly. Awards were presented. Several local businesses were recognized. Finally, the announcer stepped back onto the stage. And now, our Entrepreneur of the Year. The screen behind him displayed videos of each nominee. Then Mason's face appeared. The audience applauded. A narrator began speaking. 5 years ago, Mason Reed operated a one-man woodworking shop from a rented garage. Today, Reed Heritage Furniture employs more than 80 local craftsmen and exports handmade furniture across the country. His company has become a symbol of quality, integrity, and community values. The room erupted into applause. The winner is... A brief pause. Mason Reed. The ballroom exploded with cheers. People stood. Some whistled. Others clapped loudly. I jumped from my seat and hugged him. You did it. He smiled. No, we did. As Mason walked toward the stage, I couldn't help looking across the room. Dad remained seated. His expression never changed. But I noticed something else. His hands. They were trembling. Mason accepted the award. He thanked his employees. His customers. Grace Sullivan. Then, he looked toward our table. I want to thank someone who believed in me long before anyone else. My wife, Claire. 5 years ago, she walked away from everything she'd ever known. Not because she believed I was successful, but because she believed I could become successful. Every piece of furniture we've ever built carries her faith inside it. I covered my face with my hands. The audience stood again. This time, the applause lasted nearly a full minute. When the ceremony ended, guests surrounded Mason. Everyone wanted photographs, business cards, meetings, partnerships. I slipped away for a moment to catch my breath. As I walked down the hallway, a familiar voice stopped me. Claire. I turned around. Dad stood alone. For the first time in years, there wasn't anger in his eyes, only regret. You've done well. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing I'd ever heard. Thank you. He looked toward the ballroom. I underestimated him. I smiled softly. You underestimated both of us. He didn't argue. Instead, he quietly walked away. I watched him disappear into the crowd. Something about him felt different, broken. The following Monday, life returned to normal. Orders continued arriving. Employees stayed busy. Everything seemed perfect. Then Ryan called. His voice sounded panicked. Claire, I need to talk. What happened? It's Dad. My heart raced. Is he okay? No. It's the company. That afternoon, Ryan came to our office. He looked exhausted. He closed my office door before speaking. Dad's biggest investment failed. I frowned. What do you mean? The waterfront project. The investors pulled out. Construction stopped. I knew the project. Dad had invested almost everything into it. How bad is it? Ryan hesitated. Worse than anyone knows. 2 days later, the local news confirmed the rumors. Morgan Developments faces financial crisis. Several construction projects had been suspended. Banks demanded immediate repayment of outstanding loans. Suppliers stopped delivering materials. Shareholders demanded answers. Television reporters gathered outside company headquarters. No one knew the full story, except Leonard Hayes. And Leonard had disappeared. Police soon discovered millions of dollars missing from company accounts. Wire transfers, fake invoices, shell companies. Everything pointed toward Leonard. He had quietly stolen money for nearly 3 years, using Edward's complete trust. By the time anyone noticed, he was gone. No forwarding address, no phone number, nothing. For weeks, Dad barely left his office. He hired lawyers, private investigators, financial experts. Nothing helped. The banks froze company accounts. Creditors filed lawsuits. Employees began resigning. Clients canceled contracts. The empire he'd spent 35 years building was collapsing. Mom called me one evening. It was the first time we'd spoken in months. She sounded exhausted. Claire, your father hasn't slept in days. He won't eat. He just sits in his office. I remained silent. He won't admit it. But he's scared. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied. Instead, I felt sad. This wasn't the father I remembered. This was an old man watching his life's work disappear. A month later, the headline everyone feared finally appeared. Morgan Developments files for bankruptcy protection. Television crews surrounded the courthouse. Business analysts discussed the collapse for weeks. Some blamed the economy. Others blamed poor leadership. Only a few people knew the truth. Pride had blinded Edward Morgan. He trusted the wrong man, while pushing away the people who truly loved him. Then came the final blow. The bank repossessed my parents' mansion. The same mansion where I'd grown up. The same house I'd been forbidden to return to after my wedding. Moving trucks arrived early one morning. Neighbors watched from across the street. Furniture was carried outside. Luxury cars disappeared. The Morgan name no longer impressed anyone. One evening, Mason stood beside me on our back porch. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he asked, "Do you hate him?" I looked toward the sunset. "No. I hate what pride turned him into." Mason nodded. "What if he comes here?" I didn't answer immediately, because deep inside, I already knew. One day, he would. And I wasn't sure whether I was ready to open that door. The knock at my door. 3 weeks after my parents lost their home. Life continued moving forward. Reed Heritage Furniture had just signed its biggest contract yet. A luxury hotel chain wanted us to furnish all 12 of its new locations. Everyone at the company was celebrating. Employees laughed. Music played in the workshop. For the first time in years, it felt like we could finally breathe. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't heard her voice since the day she called to tell me about Dad's bankruptcy. I answered immediately. "Mom?" She was crying. "Claire, can you please come?" My heart skipped. "What's wrong?" "It's your father." Mason looked at me as I grabbed my car keys. "What happened?" "I don't know. But something's wrong." "I'll drive." The entire trip felt endless. Neither of us spoke. I kept remembering the last time I'd seen Dad, standing alone in that ballroom. looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. My parents were no longer living in the mansion. Instead, they had rented a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The parking lot was nearly empty. The building needed repairs. Paint peeled from the walls. Broken flower pots sat beside the entrance. 5 years earlier, Dad wouldn't have spent 5 minutes in a place like this. Now, it was all he had. Mom opened the door before I could knock. She looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. She hugged me tightly. "I'm so glad you came. Where's Dad?" She pointed toward the living room. "He hasn't spoken much in days." I slowly walked inside. Dad sat in an old armchair facing the window. He looked thinner. His expensive tailored suits were gone. Instead, he wore a simple sweater and faded jeans. For several seconds, he didn't even realize I was standing there. Finally, he turned around. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. Not at first. He slowly stood. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either." He nodded. "I deserve that." Silence filled the room. Finally, he motioned toward the couch. "Would you sit with me?" I quietly nodded. For nearly a minute, neither of us said anything. Then, Dad surprised me. "I'm sorry." Just 2 words. But they carried more weight than any speech he could have given. I stared at him, unsure whether I'd heard correctly. He looked down at his hands. "I've practiced those words 100 times. They never sounded enough. I spent my whole life believing money solved every problem. I thought success meant bigger houses, better cars, more influence." He looked at me. But when everything disappeared, so did everyone I thought was my friend. He smiled bitterly. "The only people who stayed were your mother, Ryan, and..." He struggled to finish. "You," I quietly asked. "Why?" He looked confused. "Why what? Why wasn't I enough?" The question had lived inside me for years. I needed an answer. Dad closed his eyes. "When I was your age, my father lost everything. I watched our family struggle. I promised myself my children would never know poverty." His voice trembled. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped protecting my family and started worshiping money." Tears rolled down his face. "I thought I was protecting you. I was actually pushing you away. I couldn't see it. I was too proud." I looked around the small apartment. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who once laughed at Mason's tiny workshop now lived somewhere even smaller. Not because life had been unfair, because pride had blinded him. Dad reached into a drawer beside the couch. He pulled out a small wooden box. "I've been waiting to give this back." Inside was the engagement ring box Mason had used years earlier. I frowned. "How did you get this?" He smiled sadly. "The day after your wedding, I went back to the church. It was lying beneath one of the pews. I kept it." "Why?" He looked away. "I told myself, one day you'd come home, and I'd convince you to leave him." He laughed quietly. "Instead, I spent 5 years looking at that box, wondering why I couldn't admit I was wrong." Mason quietly stepped forward. Until then, he'd remained respectfully silent. Dad looked at him. "I owe you an apology too." Mason shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do. I judged you without knowing you. I called you a failure before you'd even been given a chance. I tried to destroy your future. And yet, you still came here today." Mason smiled gently. "Claire loves you. That was enough reason." Dad lowered his head. "I don't deserve either of you." Later that evening, the 3 of us sat around the small kitchen table drinking coffee. For the first time, it felt like a family conversation. No shouting, no pride, no expectations, just honesty. Mom smiled more than I'd seen her smile in years. Ryan arrived shortly afterward. When he saw me sitting beside Dad, he stopped in the doorway. "I guess we're finally doing this." Dad looked at him. "I'm sorry." Ryan looked shocked. "Dad, I should have been a better father. I should have listened. I should have loved all of you more." Ryan quietly hugged him. Then, without thinking, I stood up too. For several seconds, the 4 of us stood together in silence. No words could erase the past. But maybe they didn't have to. As Mason and I prepared to leave, Dad stopped us at the door. I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I know I haven't earned it. But I hope one day you'll let me be part of your lives again. I smiled. You already are. His eyes filled with tears. 6 months later, we invited everyone to the grand opening of our new manufacturing facility. Over 200 employees attended. So did my parents. Dad didn't arrive wearing an expensive suit. He wore a simple blue blazer. He walked slowly through the workshop, shaking hands with every employee. Finally, he climbed onto the stage beside me. He asked for the microphone. I spent most of my life believing success was measured by money. I was wrong. He looked toward Mason. The richest man in this room isn't the one with the biggest bank account. It's the one who built a family people are proud to stand beside. Then he turned toward me. I'm proud to call Claire my daughter. And I'm proud to call Mason my son. The room erupted into applause. That night, as Mason and I sat on our porch watching the sunset, he smiled. So, was it worth it? I looked at the life we'd built together. The home, the company, the family we'd rebuilt. Then I squeezed his hand. I thought the greatest victory would be proving my father wrong. He smiled. What was it instead? I rested my head on his shoulder, getting my father back. Sometimes, the happiest endings aren't about revenge. They're about giving people the chance to become the person they should have been all along. And that's exactly what happened to us. Final message. Money can build houses, but it can't build love. Pride can protect your reputation for a while, but it can also destroy the people who matter most. Never measure someone's worth by what they own. Because the richest people are often the ones who love the deepest, forgive the hardest, and never stop believing in the people they care about.